The palace of Alexandria did not sleep. Even at night, when the torches burned low and the sea breeze carried the smell of salt and incense through marble corridors, power remained awake. Gold reflected firelight. Curtains whispered. Footsteps echoed, then disappeared. This was not merely a royal residence, it was a living mechanism of survival. From the outside, Cleopatra's court appeared radiant, columns washed in sunlight, banquets heavy with wine and music, a queen draped in silk and divinity. But beneath that splendor lay something colder. Every smile was measured. Every word carried weight. Every silence was intentional. Cleopatra ruled in a world where mercy was mistaken for weakness and hesitation invited death. Her enemies were not always soldiers at the gate. They sat at her table. They shared her blood. They slept beneath the same roof. This is where the real battles took place. Not on open fields, but in private chambers, whispered accusations, sealed orders, and decisions made when no witnesses remained. What happened inside this palace was rarely written down. Those who experienced it often did not survive to speak. Tonight, we step beyond the polished image history prefers to show, beyond the myths of seduction and romance, into the rooms where Cleopatra protected her throne the only way a ruler surrounded by enemies could. Not with charm, but with calculated, deliberate destruction. Cleopatra did not inherit a peaceful throne, but stepped into a palace already sharpened by betrayal, where power changed hands through blood rather than ceremony. The Ptolemaic dynasty she belonged to had normalized murder as governance. Siblings eliminating siblings, parents turning on their own children, all in the name of preserving control. Royal blood offered no safety here. It functioned as an invitation to violence, a visible marker that made every member of the family both ruler and potential corpse. She was young, brilliant, and dangerously exposed in a system that distrusted women and expected queens to be temporary, manipulable figures. Court advisors watched her closely, priests questioned her authority, and generals calculated whether loyalty would still benefit them tomorrow. Even within her own household, survival depended on vigilance, because her greatest rivals were those who shared her lineage and understood the rules better than anyone else. In this palace, hesitation was fatal, mercy was interpreted as weakness, and every ruler learned the same lesson early: eliminate threats quickly, or become one yourself. In Cleopatra's world, kinship did not mean loyalty, it meant proximity to danger. The Ptolemaic dynasty had long treated family members not as allies, but as political liabilities waiting for the right moment to strike. Brothers were crowned not to rule alongside their sisters, but to restrain them, replace them, or remove them entirely. From the beginning, Cleopatra understood that her closest threats slept within the palace walls and shared her name. Her younger brother, Ptolemy X, was installed as co-ruler, not as a partner, but as a counterweight meant to weaken her authority. Advisors manipulated him, positioning the boy king as the legitimate face of power while quietly pushing Cleopatra toward exile. What followed was not a simple sibling rivalry, but a calculated struggle for survival, one in which compromise meant erasure. When Cleopatra eventually reclaimed her throne, the outcome was inevitable. Her brother did not survive the conflict. His death was presented as political necessity, a tragic consequence of instability. But within the palace, the message was unmistakable. Blood ties offered no immunity. Even after victory, the danger did not end. Other relatives remained alive, visible and symbolically powerful, and Cleopatra knew that symbols could be as deadly as armies. One by one, familial rivals were neutralized through exile, forced obedience or elimination, their ends framed as acts of order rather than cruelty. In the palace, family was never sanctuary. It was the first battlefield, and Cleopatra ruled it with the same precision she applied to any enemy state. Cleopatra's palace was filled with people who spoke softly and listened carefully, because survival depended not on loyalty alone, but on invisibility. Ministers, scribes, generals, and attendants understood that power in Alexandria did not announce itself with proclamations. It moved quietly through corridors, behind curtains, and within sealed rooms. A careless word, an overheard complaint, or a poorly timed display of ambition could mark someone as a future problem. Those who opposed Cleopatra rarely did so openly. They questioned her decisions indirectly, delayed orders, or aligned themselves with rival factions while maintaining a public face of obedience. Cleopatra noticed everything. Resistance did not need to be loud to be dangerous, and she responded not with spectacle, but with absence. Courtiers who fell out of favor were reassigned, exiled, imprisoned, or simply removed from the palace's daily rhythm. Their names stopped appearing in records, their voices vanished from council meetings, their influence dissolved as if it had never existed. The palace learned quickly. Fear replaced defiance, and silence became a form of loyalty. Cleopatra did not need to execute every enemy publicly to maintain control. Uncertainty did the work for her. When people disappear without explanation, imagination becomes the most powerful enforcer of all. In this environment, the court functioned smoothly, efficiently, and obediently. Not because everyone agreed with the queen, but because no one was willing to test how far her reach extended behind closed doors. In the Hellenistic world, poison was not merely a tool of murder. It was an accepted instrument of statecraft, subtle, deniable, and perfectly suited to palace politics. Cleopatra ruled in an environment where a sudden illness could resolve a political crisis more cleanly than an execution ever could, and where death without visible violence preserved the illusion of order. The absence of blood was not mercy, it was strategy. Ancient sources hint repeatedly at poison circulating within royal courts, passed discreetly through cups, food, or medicine, leaving behind plausible explanations and no witnesses willing to speak. Cleopatra herself was said to have studied toxic substances, not out of curiosity, but necessity. Knowledge was protection. In a palace where rivals plotted constantly, understanding poison meant knowing how it worked, how it killed, and how it could be used without inviting retaliation. Enemies who grew too influential, too vocal, or too unpredictable often did not fall by blade or decree. They simply weakened, then vanished from public life. Official records spoke of sickness, fate, or the will of the gods. Within the palace, the meaning was understood. Power had been corrected, stability restored. Cleopatra maintained control not by constant violence, but by making death feel administrative, quiet, efficient, and impossible to trace back to the throne. Cleopatra understood something many rulers never did, that mercy could be more intimidating than brutality when used selectively and publicly. In the palace, she cultivated an image of restraint, allowing certain enemies to live, to kneel, to be forgiven in full view of the court. These acts were remembered, discussed, and praised, reinforcing the idea that the queen was fair, reasonable, even generous. But this mercy was never unconditional. It was a performance, carefully staged to conceal a deeper calculus. Those spared publicly were often watched more closely than those eliminated outright. Their lives continued, but under invisible restrictions: loss of influence, controlled access to power, constant surveillance. Some were removed quietly months or years later, after their usefulness ended or their symbolic value faded. Others remained alive precisely because their fear served a purpose, reminders to the court that survival depended entirely on Cleopatra's continued approval. By separating public forgiveness from private consequence, Cleopatra blurred the line between safety and danger. No one could be certain whether mercy was genuine or temporary, whether today's pardon would become tomorrow's disappearance. This uncertainty kept the palace obedient. Violence did not need to be constant when the possibility of it was always present, hovering behind every bow, every compliment, every carefully chosen word spoken in the queen's presence. Ursino IV was not merely Cleopatra's sister, she was a symbol that refused to fade. Young, visible, and publicly associated with rebellion, Ursino represented an alternative Cleopatra could not control, as long as she remained alive. Even in defeat, even in exile, she carried a dangerous legitimacy. Royal blood combined with the memory of resistance. For Cleopatra, that combination was intolerable. After being paraded through Rome as a captive, Ursino was granted sanctuary in the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, a space traditionally considered untouchable. But distance did not equal safety, and sanctity did not override political reality. Cleopatra understood that symbols did not need armies to threaten a throne. They only needed time. As long as Arsinoe lived, she could be reclaimed, rebranded, or weaponized by Rome or by future rivals in Egypt. Cleopatra chose finality. Through Roman authority, the sanctuary was violated, and Arsinoe was executed, her death carried out far from Alexandria, yet echoing loudly within the palace. It was a message delivered without ambiguity. No place was beyond reach, no bloodline exempt, no past loyalty relevant once it endangered the crown. The sister who might have become a rallying point was erased, and with her death, Cleopatra reaffirmed the harsh rule that governed her reign. Survival required certainty, and certainty required elimination. In Cleopatra's palace, loyalty was never permanent. It was a condition that expired the moment it became inconvenient. Allies who helped her secure the throne were celebrated, rewarded, and trusted, until their proximity to power began to threaten it. Cleopatra understood that yesterday's savior could easily become tomorrow's rival, especially in a court where influence was currency and ambition never slept. Some advisors grew too confident, mistaking access for immunity. Others accumulated followers, wealth, or public visibility that rivaled the queen's own authority. Cleopatra watched patiently. She allowed power to reveal itself before deciding whether it remained useful or had become dangerous. When an ally crossed that invisible line, the response was rarely dramatic. Titles were revoked, access was restricted, commands were reassigned, influence evaporated quietly, without accusation or confrontation. Those who failed to recognize the shift often paid for it later. A few disappeared into exile or imprisonment. Others were removed through illness, scandal, or sudden disgrace. Cleopatra did not rule by rewarding loyalty alone. She ruled by reminding everyone that proximity to power was temporary and conditional. In her palace, alliances were tools, not bonds, and once a tool had served its purpose, or showed signs of turning against its owner, it was discarded without hesitation. Cleopatra's actions were never confined to the walls of her palace. Rome watched her carefully, its senators and generals weighing every move, every execution, every disappearance. To them, she was both a fascinating enigma and a dangerous player. A woman whose intellect and ruthlessness could shift the balance of power in the eastern Mediterranean. Her enemies often had allies far beyond Alexandria, and every decision carried the weight of potential Roman interference. Yet Cleopatra used this scrutiny to her advantage. She framed her actions with political precision, ensuring that what could be interpreted as brutality appeared justified, necessary, and even reasonable to foreign eyes. Execution of rivals, exile of dissenters, and quiet eliminations became messages sent not only to the court, but to Rome itself. She was a ruler who controlled her realm entirely and could not be manipulated, intimidated, or replaced without consequence. The fear her enemies felt was compounded by the knowledge that any misstep could be reported to Rome, turning internal disputes into international incidents. Cleopatra understood that perception was as powerful as force. She manipulated it expertly, ensuring that while her palace remained a place of terror for insiders, it projected stability, strategy, and diplomacy to outsiders. In the shadow of the Mediterranean Empire, she ruled with precision. Every action calculated, every move observed, and every enemy accounted for, by her and by the world beyond Alexandria. In Cleopatra's palace, fear was not a byproduct of power, it was the foundation of it. Every servant, soldier, and official learned quickly that survival depended not on courage or loyalty alone, but on understanding the queen's invisible rules. The slightest misstep, a delayed report, a whispered critique, a too confident glance, could mark someone for removal, exile, or death. Compliance was bought not with gold, but with the knowledge that disobedience carried consequences, both immediate and final. Cleopatra's genius lay in her subtlety. She did not need to execute every opponent publicly. The threat of disappearance was enough to maintain order. Courtiers internalized this, policing themselves and each other, because the palace itself had become a mechanism of surveillance. Allies became cautious, enemies became cautious, and even the most ambitious minds hesitated before acting. Power in Alexandria was exercised quietly, methodically, and without visible chaos. The palace ran like a clock, every movement measured, every voice monitored. Fear shaped behavior, dictated decisions, and ensured loyalty without spectacle. Cleopatra ruled not with constant violence, but with the knowledge that the possibility of it, always present and never predictable, was the most effective form of governance of all. For centuries, Cleopatra has been remembered through the lens of legend, a seductress who captivated Rome's most powerful men, a queen draped in beauty and intrigue. Art, literature, and film have distilled her life into romance and glamour, masking the harsh realities of her reign. But the Palace of Alexandria was far removed from the stories that endure in popular imagination. There, seduction was a tool, not a lifestyle. Charm was wielded as carefully as a dagger, and survival demanded far more than allure. The truth is darker, more calculated. Cleopatra's power depended on eliminating threats before they could challenge her, manipulating allies and enemies alike, and maintaining control over every corridor, chamber, and whisper within her palace. Her brilliance lay not in seduction alone, but in the relentless precision with which she managed loyalty, fear, and influence. History remembers her as a figure of desire, but behind the myths lay a ruler who understood that in politics, even family could be lethal, and mercy was a strategy, not a virtue. To see Cleopatra as merely a romantic figure is to misunderstand the very nature of power in her world. She did not survive by chance, nor did she thrive by charm alone. She ruled because she mastered fear, observation, and the quiet mechanisms of control, ensuring that her enemies, whether sibling, courtier, or general, understood that defiance came with a cost few could endure. Cleopatra's reign was a masterclass in the exercise of power, but it came at a price, both for those around her and for the queen herself. Every decision to eliminate a rival, every calculated act of intimidation, left traces of unease in the palace. Courtiers learned to move with caution, advisors measured their words, and even the closest allies questioned whether loyalty could ever guarantee safety. Fear kept the machinery of the court running, but it also made every relationship fragile, every alliance temporary. The throne demanded vigilance, and vigilance demanded ruthlessness. Cleopatra understood that hesitation could be fatal, that mercy misapplied could be deadly. She survived where others failed because she acted decisively, never allowing uncertainty to fester. Yet in the shadows of the palace, even she could not escape the human cost of constant vigilance. Trust became a luxury, and solitude a necessity. By the time her enemies were subdued and her authority unchallenged, Cleopatra had transformed the palace into both sanctuary and prison, for herself as much as for anyone else. The brilliance of her rule was inseparable from the terror it inspired. Power, she demonstrated, was never given. It was secured, maintained, and when necessary, enforced with deliberate cruelty. In Alexandria, the crown was never light. It was a burden sharpened by fear and cemented with blood. Long after Cleopatra's reign ended, the Palace of Alexandria retained the echoes of her rule. Marble halls that once glittered with gold and jewels seemed quieter, emptier, yet the weight of her presence lingered in every corridor. Servants, soldiers, and officials had long gone, but the lessons she had instilled about fear, obedience, and the cost of ambition remained etched into the very stones. Those who survived her court carried the memory of her precision, her calculation, and her ruthlessness with them, passing tales in whispers to the next generation. Every disappearance, every exile, every quiet elimination became part of the palace's invisible architecture, shaping how power would be exercised long after her death. Cleopatra's enemies were gone, but the system she perfected, the machinery of control, the shadow of fear, remained. History would remember her as a seductress, a queen, a lover of Rome's greatest men. But the palace remembered differently. It remembered strategy, vigilance, and the uncompromising logic that ruled every choice. To understand Cleopatra is to look beyond the myths and see the palace as it truly was, a place where survival required intelligence, decisiveness, and the cold willingness to remove anyone who threatened your reign. And in that memory, her story endures, not as legend, but as a lesson in power and its price.